Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Ankle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we're talking about album number 6 from Kraftwerk, Trans-Europe Express. Right then, we've made it into the period of Kraftwerk's career where most of my love for the band centers around. I mentioned that Radioactivity, while a highly creative album, was not one of their most musical albums, and I didn't have much nostalgia or emotional connection to it. Spoilers. But all the experience of making music only with synthesizers I believe were built on and nearly perfected on Trans-Europe Express. Now, this album I first heard way back in middle school. It wasn't actually on the iTunes store yet at the time, though I went to the library and they had a CD which I borrowed and loaded on our iTunes. And as such, this album, unlike Radioactivity, very much does have the nostalgia factor, which is very important. I think I've heard this album in full after Autobahn. I can't remember when exactly though, but it was in middle school. Now, one thing about Radioactivity that also carries over to this album is the fact that this is another album that doesn't really show visions of the future like other later Kraftwerk albums, but rather once again call back to the past, into the post-World War II era. And the fact that the synthesizers sound rather dated and antiquated does in fact work in its favor. However, in this case, they don't sound quite as dated as they did on Radioactivity. And there's one main reason for that, being a new piece of equipment. In addition to using the Orchestron again, as could be heard on several tracks on here, they'd also brought in the Synthonorma sequencer. Yes, a sequencer, that thing that we now take for granted in electronic music. And you can easily tell how they used it in nearly every track, being able to play repetitive synth riffs without having to worry about screwing up. Probably most obvious on Europe Endless and Franz Schubert, which have fairly elaborate sounding riffs that sound totally automated and would probably be a pain to play in real time, especially the former, which goes on for over 9 minutes. But going back to this album sounding dated, on Radioactivity, I felt like they sounded dated because, at least in part, they were using fairly primitive analog equipment at the time. I initially thought this to be the case about this album, but here it doesn't sound quite as primitive. The callback to the post-war era this time I think is entirely incidental, directly taking inspiration from like those old traditional German folk tunes. You know, like stuff that could remind me of when I was like really little, like 3 or 4, and stayed at my German grandmother's house all the time and she liked to sing German songs to me. And that kind of stuff, which does not sound quite as good to the 21-year-old me, but I'm totally rambling right now. The use of the Orchestron, again, helped with this a lot, showing up on a lot of different tracks as well. So, going down track by track, it starts with the above-mentioned Europe Endless, consisting of our repetitive synth riffs, great bass line, synth choirs to give it that old-timey atmosphere, and vocoders that are significantly less harsh and distorted than on the previous album. They're smoother and, like, glassier. I don't know what word to describe them, but that's the best I can come up with. And I loved the hell out of this track from the very first second I heard it. It's super catchy and upbeat and happy and talks about the great stuff about Europe. I, of course, listened to it on our Europe vacation that I just got back from while we were on a train from Frankfurt to Heidelberg. I listened to this album because, of course, I'd have to listen to Trans-Europe Express on a European train ride. And I think that actually this track was more fitting for our ride since it was like a bright sunny day like today, and I could look out the window and see all the beautiful German landscapes. The title track was more fitting for being on a train and the fact that I was ridiculously jet-lagged. And the track itself was a lot darker, but I digress. Now, the album gets kind of weird with the next 2 tracks, The Hall of Mirrors and Showroom Dummies. Now, I'm told Trans-Europe Express is a concept album, but it's a really loose one if you ask me. Mainly because of these 2 tracks, which are not about Europe or trains or anything like that. Well, I guess there is a Hall of Mirrors in France, which is in Europe, but like, I don't know, I'm just really stretching at this point. And I don't know how I would even fit Showroom Dummies into it. I guess the club they talk about is in Germany? I have no idea. I'm just talking from a lyrical standpoint anyway. Sonically and instrumentally, it all fits together fairly cohesively. But going back to these two tracks, initially I was going to talk about how these tracks kinda wore out on me with a lot of repeat listens as a kid, and didn't stick out as favorites. But coming back to review them now, they're way better than I remembered. The Hall of Mirrors has that kind of dark and creepy atmosphere to it, with a lot of these cool ascending and descending synth patterns flying over the place. But otherwise, it's super minimalistic and lets these dark synth leads and bass carry most of the atmosphere. Also has this reverb-heavy percussion that reminds me a lot of Mitternacht from Autobahn. So, you know, it's that kind of track. Meanwhile, Showroom Dummy sounds like it was influenced by, like, I don't know, the soundtrack to silent films or something? I mean, it's hard to describe, really. Got these harsh bass lines that really have that old-timey quality to them, as well as a lot of these, those synth choirs again. And pretty upbeat drums, too. You know, it sounds like a song about dummies coming to life and then going into a club and dancing. Weird track, but I still like it. It's still really catchy. Not a huge personal favorite, but like the Hall of Mirrors, was a lot better after having returned to it after not really having listened to it that much in a few years. But then, of course, that brings us to the title track. Now, I admittedly have more nostalgia for the version from the mix, but having heard the original version of this track for the first time made it sound a lot more old-timey, like the rest of the album, primarily thanks to the use of the orchestra. And while I was initially really put off by it, I think it is a lot more fitting for the album now. And honestly, I feel like I really don't even have to introduce this track, which is now, of course, one of Kraftwerk's most easily recognizable tunes, with the electronic percussion imitating the rhythm of a train going over train tracks, with these big progressions of synth chords that get bigger and bigger. And other catchy melodies interspersed. Straight vocals and vocoders. And references to their meeting Iggy Pop and David Bowie, because why not? As abstract and odd as it is, it's really catchy and easily memorable, and of course it leads into the part 2 of this track, Metal on Metal. Now, on iTunes in the original German version of this album, it's separated into 2 different tracks, Metal on Metal and Abzug. But on the version I'm used to, they're the same track. So, yeah. This track starts out with these really creepy orchestra encores. Even creepier than the ones from the title track, and then bringing all this big, banging, metallic percussion, of course living up to the title. And at the end of the track, the Abzug section turns the train track percussion into a repetitive synth line and plays some of the synth chords from the title track. This track overall isn't quite as catchy as the title track, but, I mean, the title track feels incomplete without it. And this goes for any later remade versions as well. Unsurprisingly, the combination of these 2 tracks are probably my favorite part of the album, though Europe Endless is really close competition. Speaking of Europe Endless, this track is mirrored in the final 2 tracks, Franz Schubert and Endless Endless. Franz Schubert is just repetitive synth riffs, which very closely resemble those of Europe Endless. With lots of orchestra layered on top of it, same setting as they used on Radioland, but a lot more dynamic. Really does sound like electronic classical music, as you would probably guess. And Endless Endless is just a vocoder outro that further highlights the fact that yes, this ending is supposed to mirror the beginning of the album. Yeah, so that's basically about it. I mean, I see a lot of people claiming this album is Kraftwerk's best overall, period. While I can't say I personally agree with that sentiment, I do undoubtedly put it in the upper tier of their work. Its old-timey feel feels more intentional than it did on Radioactivity. Not that it wasn't intentional then, but whatever. And there may be tracks on here that I'm not always in the mood to listen to, but once again, I have to commend it for not only its unique sound, but also the fact that it's just really great music. Every melody is super easily memorable, basically don't have a lot else to say that I or other people haven't already. It's an electronic music classic, and an absolute must-listen, and you probably already knew that, but I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.